Bandwidth for the Hauger History Podcast graciously donated by Podbean.com.
What is the most important city in the Renaissance? The single most important hub and flux center of all of the important art and culture and the essence of what it meant to have a humanist movement? It was Florence, and we're going to talk about why today on this edition of the Hauger History Podcast. Okay, might have been a little exaggerated. Hello, welcome to a historic edition. Aren't they all, though? Isn't it great when you can call all of your things historic, but really it's about history, not what you're doing is so historic? All right, enough of that. And welcome into the Hauger History Podcast with Mr. Hauger. I am the second part, and I did borrow that from Paul F. Tompkins. The Renaissance really got going in the 15th century in Florence, Italy. Oh man, so much was happening in this early Renaissance period. And Florence was a union of many city-states, Milan, Venice. All of them had their own government. Some were set up with different rulers and were their own republics, but the Florentine Republic had a few wealthy families like Lorenzo de' Medici who were important patrons. Patron, vocabulary word, means sponsor. They would later rule Florence with their powerful guilds and their nobility. So the labor class really had to do their job. And there were a lot of people who weren't that interested in the ideas or weren't participating in the Renaissance, but those that were, sponsored by powerful families and political power, with people like Lorenzo de' Medici sponsoring Leonardo da Vinci and so many others, these are the people who really had the opportunity to begin exploring the Renaissance in Florence. And why? It's because of the wealth that was accumulated during this period. Florence was right in the middle of a trade route. It had a growing upper and middle class, which many cities did not. More and more people were moving to these cities, and the accumulation of wealth began to exceed and began to be enough to support not just the necessities, but the pleasures of life. Renaissance meaning rebirth, being a French word. People were now allowed to have the freedom to practice individual enjoyment, to participate in government. For example, Milan was beginning to have a self-representative rule, and a succession of dukes had absolute power until that time. But in 1400, Florence was beginning to engage in some struggles and some loss of liberty. But luckily for Florence, the Duke of Milan caught the plague and died in 1402. So sorry to highlight a silver lining in death, but it allowed Florence to thrive once again. And there was an amazing period here where people were able to sponsor artists to come from all over, and it was an exciting place to be. In 1425, the population was about 60,000 people in Florence, and members of the guilds who were skilled craftsmen and tradesmen were having really appreciating some commercial success. Trade was flourishing, it was rich. And some of the influential people in society and politics that were participating in this strong economy saw an idea to grow the welfare of the city and sponsor people who could benefit from having investment in their art. And much of the money came from wool, cloth, and manufacturing. Florentine craftsmen and textile workers would purchase untreated raw materials from England and Spain, clean it, spin it, dye it, and wove into wool. And this was excellent quality that everyone in Eastern countries and all across Europe were interested in purchasing. And lest you think that Venice had all the accomplishments of trade because it was a port city, which it did, banking was huge in Florence. Beginning 200 years before the Renaissance, Florentine bankers had gold coin, and it was such a reliable sense of purity with which they would produce their standard coinage that all of Europe wanted to use coin that was made in Florence. Bankers traded throughout Europe, and they established banking houses across the world in London, Geneva, in Bruges, and in other countries, and all of them were based on the guilds and the creation and the banking systems of Florence. So that money allowed a freedom for builders, sculptors, lawyers, philosophers to practice and pursue their lifetime's passions. In many other earlier cultures that we study in Hauger history, you need food and water, and you have to spend all your time looking for it. You're not going to flourish or have the opportunity to grow a culture. Florence was flush with beneficiaries who would supply the key makers and holders and figures that we still study today because of their enormous influence and the wealth that provided them patrons during this period. Florence's wealth helped to make it a leading cultural center of the Renaissance. And in this podcast, we're going to talk a little bit about the painting, sculptures, literature, science, and mathematics. It's all become well known and reason why so many people will still study and travel to Florence today. It was the leading cultural center of the Renaissance. The great poet Dante Alighieri, the painter Michelangelo, the brilliant thinker, artist, and inventor Leonardo da Vinci, Donatello, Raphael, so many people started their work in Florence. Cultural activity was happening all over the place. Artists would gather. They would become friends, and they would spread their ideas and influence among each other, and they were respected and given so much cultural support from the people around them that more people came to see their art and do business with them. And these people became master artists with total freedom of ideas and with the humanism, the idea to look towards nature, to see the beauty in things all around you, that it didn't just have to be a religious way of teaching Bible stories, but that art could reflect the beauty all around them, and the goods and technologies of the city could all become advanced during this time. Architecture and engineering, it's something that drew me to Florence not once but twice, to go see the Dome of Santa Maria or the Duomo del Fiore in Florence, which is an octagonal 8-sided cathedral and one of the most beautiful buildings that I can think of in the world. And they modeled their buildings after Greek and Roman ruins, this classical period, the rebirth, the renaissance of looking at those ideas once again, designing public buildings with outdoor plazas where people could gather and enjoy time together, would meet and greet and eat outside and enjoy nature. And the Duomo, which was built in 1296, it left really a centerpiece to the city when it was planned, and they had to build a sufficiently large dome, but it was a problem at the time. They didn't know how to do that without collapsing. Filippo Brunelleschi was fortunate enough to have a mathematical background and discovered a new way to construct buildings. He designed it, and it's really a true engineering genius to think that it could happen at that time, because it had no internal support beams or columns. Are you kidding me? I can't even build a stack of 3 playing cards because I can't figure out how to support it. And instead, they used huge stone arches to meet the top of the dome, and they're all leaning on each other. And they actually used hoops, and I'm not talking about NBA Jam, wood, brick, and iron wrapped around the arches, keeping them in place. It was finished in 1436. It's over 300 feet tall, and from the top of it, you can see just about all of Florence. It's a beautiful place if you ever get a chance. Maybe I'll try to find a photo from my high school trip to Europe or my more recent trip and throw it in the podcast at haugerhistory.podbean.com or in the YouTube video as well. It might work well. Painting was thriving during this time. The Medici family spent so much money supplying artists with their materials, and they would just spend huge sums of money to build up their palaces and statues and artists. These commissioned, these ordered people to create these arts, brought a number of advances in style and technique, and a competition, as you might think, right? With the NBA being the best in the world, people want to strive to improve their game and make themselves better, be like Steph Curry, whoever it might be at the moment. These artists in Florence were all doing this major renovation, using perspective, achieving depth, drawing figures closer together, colorful shading, amazing depth of field and size of objects and flat surfaces, and they used science and mathematical concepts like geography and geometry to observe how bodies are, how they move, and make them appear more lifelike, creating nature in a more realistic way. And this type of paint that they used, oil-based paint, they would mix powdered pigments with linseed, and it provided thicker and dried slower, so it didn't have to work so quickly. You could take your time and focus and layer and texture in new ways. Again, another period of Florence becoming the center. And it wasn't just that in physical paintings, it was sculptures like the Greek and Romans. Florence sculptors used freestanding statues that could be viewed on all sides, meaning they had to be sculpted in 360 degrees, and used new humanistic ideals of nature and realism to make things more realistic than ever before, and make the huge life-size David, and makes Giorgio Vasari also did so many famous works, and creating things that look so natural to believe it's not molded from a living form, but it's actually stone. It's actually amazing. And carved out of white marble, Michelangelo's David stands about 17 feet tall. Expression shows concentration, there's tension of youth on the verge of battle, and you could paint so much meaning into each sculpture. If I said paint, that was a misspeak, and I'm not even going to edit it, so how about that? Advances in literature were also happening during this time. Topics were changing. It wasn't just religion. We were getting critiques of politics, personal style, thoughts and feelings, the way people lived, and their imaginary journeys through fiction begin to take center stage with Dante and the Divine Comedy in the 1300s, Paradiso, many other works, but those are the two that the most high school students you'll probably encounter as you leave my classroom and go out into the world. And science and math were central. Engineering was taking place. People wanted to learn about a variety of topics, designing bridges, weapons, machines, paving the way for modern science and math. It was all happening with Galileo and so many other scientists that would evolve from his theories and adapt and innovate from them as well. And it's due to the wealth of banking and trade that gave people the money to sponsor such works. Well, that's enough work for me. if you want to sponsor me, get in touch. But if you need another topic covered, I'm getting a lot of notes from schools in Mount Diablo Unified and other school districts. Go ahead and shoot us a tweet at Hauger History, Hauger. Don't forget to follow and subscribe to Danny Hauger on YouTube and support our podcast so we can grow and reach more students. I just hope you're enjoying it, you're learning something, and I'm enjoying expanding my own knowledge as well as I produce these. So thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you next time. Push in your chairs, pick up your floor, and have a great day. We'll see you next time on the Hauger History Podcast.